The call came at 6:14 in the morning, and I knew before I answered it that something had shifted. Not because I'm dramatic. Not because I imagined the worst. I knew because for 11 years I had been the one they called, and that morning the number on my screen wasn't the hospital. It was my brother Patrick, and Patrick never called me. Not once in 3 years had he picked up the phone and dialed my number without a reason that served him. I am Vivienne Galloway. I am 62 years old. I was a pediatric occupational therapist for 31 years, and the morning my brother told me I had been removed from my father's medical decision documents, I was standing in my kitchen in Memphis in my bathrobe, holding a mug of Earl Grey that I never got to finish. My father was in a hospital room 218 miles away. He had been there for 9 days. And for the first time since his first hospitalization 4 years earlier, no one had called me when he was admitted. They had called Patrick. I need you to understand something about my father before I tell you what happened next, because none of the rest of this makes sense without it. My father's name is Leonard. He is 81 years old. He has moderate vascular dementia, type 2 diabetes, and a heart that a cardiologist in Nashville described to me in 2022 as working hard to keep him here. He lives with my mother, Ruth, in the house in Clarksville where I grew up, a yellow house on a cul-de-sac with a dogwood tree in the front yard that my father planted the year I was born. For 4 years, I drove that 218-mile round trip. Every third weekend, sometimes every second. I drove my silver Honda Civic down I-24 on a Friday evening after work, stayed through Sunday, drove home. I scheduled his cardiology follow-ups. I kept the small handwritten ledger in his kitchen drawer that tracked his medications, what he took, when he took it, what the dosages were after each adjustment. I was the one who noticed in March of 2023 that his blood pressure medication had been refilled twice in 6 weeks, and no one could explain why. I was the one who flagged it to Dr. Osei, his cardiologist. My mother was present for all of this. She was always home when I arrived. She made coffee and set it on the table and watched me sort the medications into the weekly dispenser and said nothing. She was not unkind to me during those visits, or not obviously unkind. She was something harder to describe. She was a woman who had spent 40 years of her marriage being the center of my father's world, and now my father sometimes forgot her name and remembered mine, and she could not make peace with that. I think, looking back, that what drove my mother was not cruelty for its own sake. It was fear. Pure animal fear that she was losing my father, and losing him in a way she couldn't control, which meant that anyone who could navigate that world better than she could was a threat. His cardiologist knew my name. The pharmacist knew my voice. The overnight nurse on the 3rd floor at Clarksville Regional knew to call me if his oxygen dipped. And my mother, who had been his wife for 54 years, was sometimes standing in the hallway while the medical staff asked me questions she couldn't answer. That is not an excuse for what she did, but it is a reason. And I have learned, slowly, to hold both of those things at the same time. My father had a living will and a healthcare power of attorney drawn up in the fall of 2021. I know the date exactly because I drove to the attorney's office with him on a Tuesday in October, and we had lunch at a diner on the way home, and he ordered a BLT and told me I was the most capable person he had ever known. I did not tell my mother we were going. He asked me not to, and I respected that because he was still a man who had the right to make his own decisions, and he had made his. He wanted me to be the one. She found out eventually, the way families find out things they weren't supposed to know. A piece of mail. A form from the attorney's office that arrived during a week I wasn't there. I don't know exactly what she did with that information in the months that followed, or what she told herself about it. What I do know is that in January 2026, without telling me, without calling me, without giving me any notice at all, she contacted Clarksville Regional's Patient Services Office and submitted a request to update the emergency contact and medical proxy designation on file. She submitted it herself. She signed her own name. She removed mine. The hospital processed it. They were not required to notify me. The document my father and I had executed was in the attorney's files, not in mine, and when my father was admitted 9 days before Patrick's call, the hospital went to the file they had on record. My name wasn't there anymore. Patrick was the proxy on record. Patrick, who had not driven to Clarksville once in 14 months. I drove to Clarksville the same day Patrick called. I did not tell my mother I was coming. I arrived at the hospital at 2:47 in the afternoon and went straight to the nurse's station on the cardiac floor, and the nurse behind the desk, a young woman named Jamie, whose name tag I still remember, looked at my father's file and said, carefully and politely, that I was not listed as a contact. I stood there for a moment. I did not raise my voice. I said I understood, and I asked if I could see my father as a visitor, and she said yes, of course, and I went in. He was awake. He knew me. He called me Viv and reached for my hand and told me the food was terrible, and I laughed because I didn't know what else to do, and I held his hand for 40 minutes and watched the numbers on his monitors and thought about the medication ledger in the kitchen drawer at the yellow house on the cul-de-sac. My mother arrived at the room at 3:31. I know because I looked at my watch when I heard her voice in the hallway. She came through the door and stopped when she saw me, and for a moment neither of us spoke, and my father looked between us the way he sometimes did when he sensed something he couldn't quite name. She stepped in front of me. Not all the way, but enough. She positioned herself between me and the door and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as resolute. "You don't get to make decisions for this family anymore," she said. "I've handled it." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about all the Fridays I had driven down I-24. I thought about the Wednesday in 2023, when I had sat in a hospital corridor for 6 hours while my father was in surgery and held my mother's hand and told her he was going to be fine. I thought about the ledger in the kitchen drawer. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not give her the scene I could tell she was waiting for. "Okay," I said. She blinked. She had expected something else. I stayed another 20 minutes with my father. I told him I loved him. He squeezed my hand and said, "Come back on Sunday, Viv. Bring the good tea." I told him I would. Then I walked out of the hospital and sat in my Honda Civic in the parking garage on the second level, and I called a woman named Nora. Nora Bellamy had been my closest friend since we were 26 years old. She was also, after 28 years of nursing, the charge nurse on the geriatric unit at a different hospital across town. She answered on the second ring. "She had me removed," I said. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Viv, the document your dad signed with the attorney, do you have a copy?" I had not looked for it. I had assumed it was only at the attorney's office. "Go home," Nora said. "Look in the accordion file, the one on his study shelf. He used to make copies of everything." I sat in the parking garage for another 6 minutes. I thought about my father's study. I thought about the row of accordion files on the second shelf of his bookcase, color-coded by year, a habit left over from 30 years of working in insurance. Then I started the car. I went to the yellow house on the cul-de-sac. My mother was still at the hospital. I still had a key. She had never asked for it back, which I have come to think of as the one oversight she made, and I let myself in through the side door that opens into the mudroom, the one with the coat hooks my father built himself the summer I was 13. The house smelled the way it always smelled. Lemon dish soap and something underneath it, something older, the particular quiet of a house that has been lived in by the same two people for 40 years. I went to my father's study. The bookcase was exactly as I remembered it. Accordion files, 12 of them, lined up in a row on the second shelf, organized by year in my father's careful handwriting on the tabs. Each one had a strip of color-coded tape along the spine. Legal matters, red tape. Financial records, blue tape. Medical, green tape. The 2021 file had green tape and red tape both. My hands were entirely steady when I pulled it from the shelf. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect that a moment like this one comes with shaking hands and a racing heart. Mine didn't. I had spent 31 years as a therapist working with children in crisis, and somewhere in that career, I had developed a particular kind of calm that only arrives when the thing you are looking for is real, and you finally have your hands on it. Inside the accordion file, behind the tab labeled Legal, October 2021, was a manila envelope. Inside the envelope was a copy of the Healthcare Power of Attorney, notarized, dated October 19, 2021, with my father's signature and mine. My name was on page 1, page 3, and the signature block. I sat down in my father's study chair, the old leather one with the crack along the armrest that he had always meant to repair. I put the document on the desk in front of me. I read it twice. Then I called Nora back. "I have it," I said. She asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I wanted to know who to call. She gave me the name of the hospital ethics department. She told me they had a patient advocacy line specifically for power of attorney disputes. She told me to call before 5 p.m. because the department went to reduce staffing after hours and to ask for the consultant on call, and to be specific and factual and not emotional because the consultant would be taking notes. I called at 4:11 p.m. I spoke with a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Anita Sewell. Her voice was measured and careful and precise. I told her who I was. I told her my father's name and his date of birth and his current room number at Clarksville Regional. I told her I had a notarized healthcare power of attorney designating me as his medical proxy, executed in October 2021 when my father had full legal decision-making capacity. I told her that an updated record had been filed with the hospital by my mother in January 2026, removing my name, and that I had not been notified. I told her I had the original document in my hand. Dr. Sewell asked me to hold for 2 minutes. Then she came back and asked me to spell my last name again. "Galloway," I said. "Galloway." She was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Galloway," she said, "the document on file at this hospital is from January of this year. However, a validly executed power of attorney that predates a unilateral amendment, particularly when one party to the original document is the patient himself, and when that patient's current capacity to authorize the amendment may be in question, is something our ethics office is required to review. I'd like to send one of our consultants to follow up. Would you be available tomorrow?" I said yes. She told me the follow-up would happen at the family home, since that was where the primary caregiver was operating, and that the purpose was a review of the current care framework and documentation, not a punitive visit. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my father's chair for a long time after that. The light through the study window was going orange, the late afternoon light of early spring that hits the dogwood at a particular angle and makes the branches look like they're lit from inside. My father had sat in this chair every evening for 40 years. He had read in it. He had paid his bills at this desk. He had kept his files and his records and his copies of everything because he was a man who believed that if something mattered, you documented it. He had taught me that. I had just never thought I would need it for this. I did not go back to the hospital that evening. I drove instead to the parking lot of a grocery store 6 blocks from the yellow house, and I sat there with the engine off and the accordion file on the passenger seat. It was 5:47 p.m. The sky had gone the color of old pewter. I thought about my father asking me to come back Sunday, with the good tea. I thought about the possibility that the review would go wrong, that the hospital would defer to the more recent filing, that the document in the manila envelope would not be enough. I thought about what it would mean to be shut out entirely, to drive to that hospital and be told, again, that I was not on the list. I sat with that for a long time. I did not push it away. I let it be as heavy as it was. Then I thought about my father's careful handwriting on the tab of the accordion file. Legal, October 2021. He had made a copy. He had always made a copy. I started the car. I drove to a hotel 3 miles from my parents' house and I checked in, and I ordered food I barely tasted, and I called my daughter in Atlanta and talked to her about her garden and her dog and the slow leak in her apartment ceiling that her landlord still hadn't fixed. I did not tell her what was happening. She was 29 years old, and she had her own life to be getting on with, and I did not want to hand her something that wasn't resolved yet. After I hung up, I opened the Notes app on my phone, and I wrote down everything. Every date I had driven to Clarksville in the past 4 years, every appointment I had attended, every call I had made to Dr. Osei's office, every entry in the medication ledger I could remember. I wrote for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Family love without respect eventually becomes something else. I didn't have the words for it yet that night, but I knew that whatever my mother had done had not been done to protect my father. It had been done to protect herself, and that the difference between those two things was the whole story. That was the aphorism I didn't write down. It just settled somewhere in me, the way true things do, quietly, while I was doing something else. I set my alarm for 7 a.m. I put the accordion file on the nightstand beside the hotel lamp, and I slept better than I had expected to. My mother was going to have a visitor in the morning. She just didn't know it yet. I arrived at the yellow house at 9:15 the next morning. My mother was in the kitchen. I could see her through the front window before I knocked, moving between the counter and the stove with the particular efficiency of a woman who is composing herself by keeping busy. I knocked. She opened the door, and her expression moved through several things very quickly. Surprise, then something almost like relief, then the careful arrangement of a face that had decided to be in charge.
"Vivienne," she said.
"Good morning, Mom," I said. She let me in because there was nothing else she could do in the moment, and I stepped into the entryway and set my coat on the rack by the door. The navy wool coat I had worn every winter for 6 years, the one with the missing button on the third clasp that I kept meaning to replace, and I sat down at the kitchen table. She made coffee. I think she needed something to do with her hands. We talked, or something like it. She told me that my father was stable, that his numbers had improved overnight, that the cardiologist was pleased. I asked questions. I listened. I did not bring up the document or the phone call I had made, or the name I had found on her list of updates. At 9:47, a car pulled into the driveway. My mother looked through the kitchen window. A woman in a camel coat was walking up the front path, a hospital ID lanyard visible at her collar. "Who is that?" my mother said. I folded my hands on the table. The knock at the door was 3 clear, measured raps. My mother went to answer it. I stayed at the table.
"Good morning," the woman said.
"I'm Dr. Anita Sewell. I'm from the hospital ethics office. I'm here regarding the power of attorney documentation on file for Leonard Galloway. I spoke yesterday with a Vivienne Galloway. Is she here?" My mother turned to look at me. I raised my hand. Dr. Sewell came into the kitchen and sat down at the table and opened a soft leather folder. She was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses on a cord around her neck and a voice that was professionally kind and entirely immovable. She explained her role. She explained what a healthcare power of attorney review entailed. She explained that when a validly executed document existed that predated a unilateral amendment, and when the patient's current cognitive capacity was in question, the hospital's ethics office was required to verify that the amendment had been made consistent with the patient's wishes and not in contravention of a prior legal directive. She asked my mother when the January update had been submitted. My mother said she had filled out a form. She said she had been acting in the family's best interest. Dr. Sewell listened to all of this with the same expression. Then she set the October 2021 document on the table, the copy I had handed her when she arrived, and pointed to my father's signature. "Mrs. Galloway," she said, "do you know when this was executed?" My mother looked at the document for a long time. "No," she finally said. "For years ago," Dr. Sewell said. "When your husband had full capacity and was under no duress, he designated your daughter as his medical proxy. The hospital will be reinstating that designation today, pending a capacity assessment next week. That assessment will determine whether your husband can authorize any further changes himself. Until then, Vivienne Galloway is the proxy of record." The kitchen was very quiet. The copper kettle on the stove was the only sound in the room. My mother sat at that table for a long time after Dr. Sewell left. She sat with her coffee going cold in front of her and the copy of the October 2021 document still lying on the table between us, my father's signature visible from where she was sitting. I didn't speak first. I had decided, somewhere in the hotel the night before, that I was not going to manage her reaction. I was going to let it be what it was. "I was trying to protect him," she finally said. I looked at her. I thought about the right words and the wrong ones. I thought about 30 years of driving and scheduling and sitting in waiting rooms and filling medication dispensers and writing dates in a handwritten ledger. I thought about a Tuesday in October and a BLT sandwich at a diner, and my father saying I was the most capable person he had ever known. "I know," I said. "I believe you thought that." She looked up at me. "But you removed my name," I said. "You called the hospital and you took me off the form and you didn't tell me. And the next time Dad was admitted, no one called me for 9 days." She started to say something. I held up one hand. "I'm not asking you to justify it," I said. "I'm telling you what happened." She closed her mouth. I stayed for another hour. I helped her write a list of the questions she wanted to ask the cardiologist at the next appointment. I looked at the medication ledger in the kitchen drawer. It was still there, my handwriting in the left column, new entries in hers in the right, and I made a note of a dosage discrepancy I wanted to flag with Dr. Osei. Before I left, I put my coat back on and I stood in the entryway and I said what I had decided to say. I'm going to keep being involved in Dad's care, I said. That's not a conversation. That's just what's going to happen. What I'm offering you is a chance to be part of that alongside me instead of against me. She didn't answer right away. And if I don't, she said, then I'll manage his care through the proper channels, I said. The same way I did yesterday. I drove home to Memphis that afternoon. The drive took 3 hours and 14 minutes, and I listened to a podcast about the history of bridge design for most of it, which sounds strange, but was exactly what I needed, something technical and impersonal and requiring just enough attention to keep me present. Over the next 3 weeks, Patrick called me twice. The first call was performative. He wanted to know what I had done and why, and I explained it to him factually and without apology, and he was quiet in the way people are quiet when they expected a fight and didn't get one. The second call was different. He called from his car on a Wednesday evening and he said he'd been to see Dad, and that Dad had asked for me. He asked if you were coming Sunday, Patrick said. With the tea. I'll be there, I said. I went back the following Sunday. I brought Earl Grey. The tin with a slight dent in the lid, the one I had been buying since the pharmacy near my apartment started stocking it, and I sat with my father for 3 hours, and he was having a clear day, the kind that came less and less often but mattered more each time they did. My mother was in the house. We moved around each other carefully, politely. She made lunch. I washed up afterward. We did not discuss the ethics visit or the document or what had happened. We talked about the dogwood tree, which had started to bud early, and whether the late frost predicted for the following week would damage it. It was not warm. It was not easy, but it was possible. 3 months after that Sunday, the capacity assessment was completed. My father did not have the cognitive standing to authorize a new amendment at that point. The power of attorney remained in place. I updated the medication ledger on the visit that followed. I added a new column for the blood thinner the cardiologist had introduced, and I wrote the dosage and the schedule in my own handwriting, and I left the ledger in its place in the kitchen drawer where it had always been. My mother watched me do it from the kitchen doorway.
She didn't say anything.
But she didn't leave the room either. I don't know what that means yet. I'm not sure I need to decide. What I know is that my father is being cared for correctly. What I know is that the document he signed in October of 2021 is what he wanted, and that his wishes are being honored, and that the last time I saw him, he told me the tea was better when I brought it. Some things are simple, even when everything around them is not. I have had a lot of time to think about what my mother did and what it means and how I feel about it now that the immediate crisis is past. I don't hate her. That is the truest thing I can tell you. She is a woman who has spent 54 years loving one person completely, and that person is becoming someone she doesn't fully recognize anymore, and she is terrified in a way I think she lacks the language to describe. I understand that fear. I have held to myself in my own way every time I drive down I-24 and wonder how much of my father I will find when I get there. But understanding someone's fear does not mean accepting what they do with it. Some people only know how to love what they can control. And when control slips, they reach for forms for phone calls, for whatever they can still sign their name to. Forgiveness is not access. Understanding is not reunion. And compassion for a person's fear is not an agreement to disappear on their behalf. I've been disappearing in small ways for most of my adult life. I disappeared when my mother stood in front of the hospital room door and told me I no longer had a seat at the table. I almost disappeared the night I sat in that parking lot watching the sky go the color of old pewter, when I nearly let the weight of it convince me that the document in the accordion file couldn't possibly be enough. Saying no, filing that call, driving back to that house, sitting at that kitchen table and waiting, did not make me cruel. It made me responsible. Responsible to my father, who had signed his name to something because he trusted me. Love that requires you to make yourself invisible is not love. It is management. I think about the October Tuesday sometimes. The BLT at the diner. My father saying I was the most capable person he had ever known. I think he knew, even then, that the document mattered less for legal reasons than for this one. That someone who loved him would fight to stay in the room. I stayed in the room. If you have ever been quietly removed from something that was yours, a conversation, a decision, a family table, without being told, without being asked, what would it take for you to reach into the drawer and find out what you were holding all along?